He's Nick Whalen, joining Boston has entered the chat now, analyst for RotoWire, also the host on SiriusXM's channels for the NBA and fantasy football, and he's a University of Wisconsin grad, so it's always good to have a Badger on the show. Nick, thanks for taking the time, man. How are we doing today?
Hey, I'm doing great, guys. Appreciate the opportunity to jump on with you, and we are, 7 hours away from NFL Week 1. I can't wait.
Exactly. It's almost here. We finally, all the talks of drafts, ADP, mocks, it's all behind us. We're in the promised land Thursday, Friday, and Sunday of football. And let's start with just getting into week 1. It's finally here. It's a first step of figuring out pretty much like who's actually good, who's bad, how offenses look, and all the guys we have with these expectations. But I want to start with the guys that you're identifying as like must starts. It may not be the popular ones. We know who you get in the first and second round, but who are like 3 guys you can say of like, these are dudes you should start week 1, especially with their matchup?
Yeah, I'm not going to tell you should start Christian McCaffrey or Breece Hall or Bijan Robinson. Those guys are going to be in your lineup this week. But, I mean, with the depth at the wide receiver position in the NFL right now, I think that's where a lot of the difficult start sits are going to come, particularly in week 1. I mean, you have guys who are, legit number 1 receivers on their own team or, high-end number 2s who are going off the board as, the wide receiver 30 through the wide receiver 40 this year. Obviously, something I always tell people in fantasy leagues, if you have a flex spot, if it's a PPR league, you almost always want to try to get a receiver in that spot. Unless you went really running back heavy, they're going to have a higher floor for that flex. So a couple receivers who are maybe on that borderline this week, who I like, we start with Jackson Smith-Njigba. And he was my big fantasy draft crush, especially over the last few weeks. We started to see his ADP rise a little bit, but I think that's totally warranted. You were still getting Jackson Smith-Njigba around where he finished last season. And, it felt like somewhat of a down rookie year for him, especially considering he was the first receiver off the board in that 2023 draft. But I think this is the year that he really overtakes Tyler Lockett in a big way. I mean, I think we kind of forget the level of talent that we're dealing with JSN. He had that kind of weird final season at Ohio State. I think if that final college season had gone better, he might have been a top 10 pick. I mean, he's on the talent level to me of someone like a Malik Neighbors or a Rome Odunze. And I love the matchup for Seattle this week. They get the Denver Broncos. Bo Nix making his first start on the road in week 1. I think this is a really, really good spot for Seattle and this new look offense to get it going. So I'm starting Jackson Smith-Njigba in as many leagues as I can. Christian Watson is another interesting one. One of those receivers who has some name value, but given the injuries over the last couple of years, there was some caution in approaching him in drafts. But I think early in the season, especially, is when I trust Christian Watson. Can that hamstring actually make it through 17 games? We will see. But Christian Watson did not have any setbacks whatsoever throughout training camp. Participated in literally every single day of practice. I'm sitting here in the state of Wisconsin. If you follow the Packers like I do, that has not been the case over the last couple of years. And whenever Christian Watson is on the field and whenever he's fully healthy, which he will be tomorrow night in Sao Paulo, he makes a huge difference, right? I mean, we have 4 receivers in this Packers receiver room that we like, but Christian Watson, to me, he's the skeleton key. He's the difference maker. He's the 6'4" guy with 4.3 speed, right? Nobody else, Romeo Doubs, Dontayvion Wicks, Jaden Reed, as talented as those guys are, they don't have that high level upside of Christian Watson. So I would not be surprised if we see Watson involved early and often tomorrow night. A couple quick ones that I'm keeping an eye on as well. Calvin Ridley, if DeAndre Hopkins does not play for the Tennessee Titans, which is a real possibility. Remember, Hopkins got injured back in July. Sounds like he's going to be close to a game time call. If he's out, Calvin Ridley becomes far and away the number 1 target for Will Levis. I think that Bears-Titans game is going to be exciting. I think it's going to be back and forth. I think the Titans are going to have to score to keep up with Chicago. So I don't mind starting Calvin Ridley, especially if Hopkins is out. And then one more bonus, a quarterback who I like this week, Tua Tagovailoa. Where he was going in drafts, he was often being taken as a second quarterback, but he's going up against a Jags defense that allowed almost 23 fantasy points per game to quarterbacks last season. That was the 5th most in the NFL. We got a really high total down in Miami. I would start Tua this week over Caleb Williams. I would start him over Brock Purdy going up against that Jets defense. I'd maybe even start him over Dak Prescott, who has to go on the road to Cleveland, and maybe guys, over Joe Burrow, who plays your Patriots.
Hey, Joe Burrow at home. I know I'm holding my breath on this defense for the Patriots. We'll get into that. I like that Joe Burrow start, but I love that nod of Christian Watson and Tua Tagovailoa while they're healthy and while that offense is healthy. Because, Nick, fantasy football is a week-by-week thing. Win each week, and then you get to the promised land. So who are the guys now? In that same breath, you talked about the guys that are must-start. Who are guys that maybe are in that same scope, but you're saying, you know what? I would sit them week 1.
Yeah, Keenan Allen is a name who comes to mind for me, and the acquisition cost, I should say, for Keenan Allen was significantly lower this season than it's been in years past. And I tend to be a Keenan Allen believer. I think he still has one more good year left in him. I think he's kind of the safety blanket, the veteran in that receiver room for Caleb Williams. But much like DeAndre Hopkins, Keenan Allen is banged up. I think he's probably going to play, but could there be limited snaps? Could they try to feature Rome Odunze a bit more? There were some reports earlier in camp that Keenan Allen was a little bit overweight. So, he's certainly somebody that I ended up targeting because of the acquisition costs in a lot of my late drafts, but I'm probably not going to throw him out there in week one. Guys, I'm just staying away early on from the Dallas backfield as well. I was more of a Rico Dowdle guy over Ezekiel Elliott. I want to see how it plays out, right? We have a bunch of backfields going into week one where we're just not really sure what that split is going to look like. And, going on the road to Cleveland against that defense, that kind of scares me. I mean, even if you make the right choice between Zeke and Dowdle, what's really the upside against this Cleveland team? I don't think it's very high. So I'm not starting Zeke or Dowdle unless I absolutely have to. Jaylen Warren, he's another running back that I'm staying away from. And then Brian Robinson of the Washington Commanders. Tampa Bay, great defense in terms of limiting running backs in fantasy last season. They allowed only 7 rushing touchdowns on the year, only 2 receiving touchdowns to running backs last season. And of course, that applies to Austin Eckler as well. I've just been totally out on Eckler. I think his best days are behind him. But those are some of the running backs and receivers who I'll be staying away from this week.
I love you brought up that Dallas backfield. I was actually going to ask you about it later on, but let's address it right now. I mean, Ezekiel Elliott back in Dallas, coming off a career low in attempts when he was with the Patriots, but then there is those whispers of Rico Dowdle. Same height, 215, a little lighter. But how do you read this Dallas backfield? And now I want to look at it from like a season-wide scope, not just this week. Do you think it's Zeke's and then Dowdle with the younger legs eventually takes over?
I think it'll be a true split early on. And, to me, based on where both of those guys were being drafted, you didn't have to take them as your RB2. You didn't really even have to take them as your RB3, depending on how your draft played out. So you shouldn't necessarily be in a situation, unless you're in a deep league or, kind of a higher roster league where you feel like you need to start either of them. But again, like Dowdle to me is kind of the home run hitter for this offense, right? Zeke might be a little bit safer. You got to give Zeke credit for what he did in New England last season. If you had him in a PPR league, he wasn't as bad as you would think. I mean, he caught only one fewer pass on the entire season than Jahmyr Gibbs and Joe Mixon did. I mean, it was really the pass catching out of the backfield that salvaged his fantasy value. How much of that volume can we depend on now that he is in this timeshare with Rico Dowdle? He's a year older. It's a nice story, right? Zeke going back to Dallas, but I don't know, man. I mean, this feels like Tracy McGrady, like when he was on the Hawks, or Tracy McGrady on the Knicks. You're like, oh, all right, yeah, there's some name value here, but how much of an impact is he really going to make? And of course, they added Dalvin Cook as well. And I don't know if Dalvin Cook's ultimately going to make much of an impact here, but we knew Dallas was going to add somebody. They weren't comfortable with just the Dowdle and Zeke pairing. So now that you have this third veteran in the mix, and again, you're going up against the Cleveland Browns in week one, I want to see how it plays out, before I fully buy in on either of those as a fantasy starter. But if I have to choose one, I'm going Rico Dowdle.
I like that. Rico Dowdle, long-term investment can pay off. And you're right. I mean, going into week one, sit back, observe, figure out that Dallas offense and your roster as well. Let's talk Patriots. You brought them up. I mean, the Pats are going on the road to Cincinnati. But looking at this offense in general, and we can talk long-term, we can talk week one, are there any fantasy-relevant pieces in this Patriots offense that you like?
Are there any fantasy relevant pieces? Sure. Are there any that I like? Maybe not. It's really just Ramondre Stevenson, right? I mean, unless you're in, like a 25 round league, and you'll see Jalen Polk maybe go late in the draft. The Patriots have essentially one player who goes in the top 150, right? I mean, it's Ramondre Stevenson, and that's about it. And I don't love this matchup for Ramondre. I don't love the Pats schedule, by the way, overall. I mean, this is for a team that might only win 3 or 4 games. Part of the reason for that is there are just no cupcakes. There are no cupcakes this season for New England. Obviously, you got 6 really difficult division games. Their out-of-division schedule is tough. Like, there's not a lot of spots you circle and say, all right, I love this spot for Ramondre Stevenson. It's just going to be volume-based. It's going to be volume-based as it was last season. I think we see a lot of those, like, 17 carries for 55 yards type of games. You hope that he plunges one in from the 2-yard line. Maybe he gives you 4 or 5 catches out of the backfield from Jacoby Brissett. But I have a lot of concerns, as I'm sure you do as well, about the Patriots. I mean, it's not often you see a head coach openly discussing how terrible his own offensive line is 2 weeks before the season. I mean, you come out and say, yeah, Drake May, he's been better. He's been better than Brissett, but we literally cannot start him because we're worried about him getting killed because of this offensive line. And if you're worried about what that means for Drake May, I think you got to be worried about what it means for Stevenson.
Yeah, I think you're right. And this is an offense that'll rely on the run. But again, the defenses they go up against, Cincinnati, we'll see how they do against the run this year. Seattle, the Jets, 49ers to start. But what you point out, I mean, the advice I gave to my buddy in a different league, he drafted Ramondre Stevenson. I said, trade him as soon as you can because I don't know if the running lanes will be there. You're right, Nick. The offensive line hasn't been healthy all year. I don't like anyone from this piece,
Right.
so you're right. That was a twofold question. Maybe Pop Douglas, just because he'll get a lot of targets.
Yeah.
But he's undersized, and I don't know if he can stay healthy. But again, this is an offense I'd kind of stay away. Are there any offenses that you look across and you say, I'm just going to stay away from these altogether?
Well, New England is certainly number one on that list for me. I've been staying away from the Raiders for the most part. I'm not really buying in on Zamir White. There's been some concerns there as far as what that workload could look like. Does Alexander Madison work his way into the mix? And, as far as bad quarterbacking goes, like Gardner Minshew is a fairly fantasy-friendly quarterback. He's not Tim Boyle. He's not Zach Wilson. He's willing to air it out. There's going to be the pop games there. But when you look at the acquisition cost for someone like Davante Adams, obviously he's a great player. He's a future Hall of Famer. I'm not buying him as a mid-second round pick. We saw a big step back from Davante last season. I think that carries over to this year as well. It feels like he's kind of coasting on name value at this point. I don't even know if he's still on the Raiders, come the trade deadline. I think there's a real chance that they can move on from him. But I will say the one expatriate and current Raider who I really like is Jakobi Meyers. I mean, he's somebody who's had terrible quarterbacking his entire career, and yet all he does is produce. I mean, he racked up 106 targets in 16 games last season, basically the same number of targets as Nico Collins. He had more targets than Brandon Ayuk last season, 3 straight 800-yard seasons for Jakobi Meyers, despite that bad QB play in both Vegas and New England. He found his way into the end zone 10 times last year. And look, if I'm sitting here saying that I think Davante Adams might be traded midseason, what does that mean? It means Jakobi Meyers might be the number one receiver for the Vegas Raiders come week 8 or 9.
Especially with an offense with Brock Bowers, your tight end they took in the first round, is already dealing with injuries himself. I love that you pointed out Jakobi Meyers. Think the same thing. Davante Adams is dealt. If he goes to New York, that affects Garrett Wilson, but that upticks on Meyers. Now looking at the league as a whole, we know CMC finished as a number one fantasy player last season. Who do you think finishes as a number one player in fantasy football this season?
It's a really interesting question. Part of it, of course, depends on your league settings. If you're in a non-PPR league, then it's probably not going to be a receiver who ends up earning that title. And for what it's worth, in terms of total fantasy production in PPR leagues, a quarterback has been the top overall player in 5 of the last 7 seasons. So that is something to keep in mind. But saying a quarterback for this question is boring. I'm not going to go in that direction. So I think to look at the running backs first, the obvious answer is Christian McCaffrey, but I went through yesterday. I looked up the data from the last decade in terms of fantasy production. No running back has finished as the top fantasy RB in PPR leagues in consecutive seasons. Now, McCaffrey has done it twice in that. Came back in his days with the Carolina Panthers. So history suggests that somebody else, some other running back, will be the top running back in terms of PPR this season. With that said, CMC was the top running back by more than 100 fantasy points last year. So he has some wiggle room. Like, he could miss a game, and if he produces at the same level as last year, he could still be the RB1. He was 7.5 fantasy points per game better than the second best fantasy running back last year, which is Breece Hall. That is a crazy, crazy split. If CMC stays healthy, he has to be the guy. I'm not veering away from that. But again, that's the boring answer. I think there's a case for Breece Hall. I think there's a case for Bijan Robinson in Atlanta if that team hits the ground running. But if you're looking for a dark horse, how about Travis Etienne in Jacksonville? He was the RB3 last season, and he barely eclipsed 1,000 yards. I mean, a lot of it was pass catching. A lot of it was volume. The Jaguars' offensive line, we'll see. I'm actually a Jaguars fan. I should disclose that to you before I talk about Etienne. I'm not optimistic, but they can't be any worse than they were last season. Etienne got almost 60 passes last year, but only had 1 receiving touchdown. I think if Travis Etienne can move closer to 1,300 yards, maybe keep that same receiving volume, find the end zone 4 or 5 times. If McCaffrey takes a step back or if he gets hurt, Travis Etienne would be kind of my dark horse running back who could grab that title.